Well, hello, Faith Church, and whoever else may be watching, coming at you again through YouTube. I think this is the 7th or 8th week during our COVID-19 little lockdown. I'm not sure if you were able to catch the governor's address on Friday. There seems to be a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel. Next week, I'll be meeting with a number of our leaders in various areas and getting a game plan together, given the governor's recommendations of how we're going to reopen, obviously in stages. So a couple of words to remember, I think, during this time. One, obviously, is going to be gradual, but just be flexible. You know, I think during this time, all churches, this is new territory, and so we are probably going to get some things wrong that we're going to have to change. You know, in the prior next week, we're going to try to make this as safe as a place as possible as we return to some type of new abnormalcy during this time. But the other word I want you to keep in mind is faith. As we open up various places in our society, in our culture, whether it's restaurants or gyms or churches, before the virus, it took very little, I would say, of faith in terms of your physical well-being to go to church. Probably the best example of this might be just maybe the drive-in. You know, once you got there, it's you feel pretty safe. That's just not going to be the case, you know, anymore. We're definitely going to have to demonstrate a certain amount of faith as we gather back together, whether it's in groups of 30 and under for a while, whether we eventually get to 100 and then we keep on going. We've got a lot of things to discuss. How in the world do you teach a 4-year-old what it means to be socially distant? I'm not sure if you can do that. And so we're going to be wrestling with those questions. We also want to be safe in terms of some of those who are in danger categories, whether it's their age or various health concerns. And so just be in prayer for us. I'm sure we're going to get some things right out of the box, and then I'm sure we're going to have to go back to the laboratory again and discuss a new formula, a new strategy of how we're going to do that. But in the meantime, we've been on this teaching series. Last week we launched it called Renewed Hope. What a time for us to do that. A renewed hope that is demonstrated in the book of 1 Samuel. Really a turnaround in really every area of the nation of Israel. The nation of Israel as a whole, families as well, and as well as individual priests. And boy, that's going to be quite a ride that we're going to be on for the next several weeks, if not months, going through the book of 1 Samuel. In the meantime, as we kind of figure out how we're going to be coming back in various stages, just again, this is how we've been connecting. Facebook and YouTube, and you've been doing a wonderful job, I believe, of listening to this goofy guy who's very unphotogenic and kind of getting church in a different way and being encouraged from the scripture. I'm going to ask you to do a favor for me. If you have not subscribed to our channel and you're watching this, the little bell, it's either over here or maybe it's over here. I'm not real sure. But that would really help us out to get a gauge of how many people have subscribed to our YouTube page. We're also going to ask you to share this on whatever digital platform that you may use, whether it's Facebook, whether it's Instagram, or help us to spread the word by word of mouth digitally at this time. I can tell you, there have been a number of stories that I could probably communicate of people that are watching that I would have never thought would have been watching. Just various people that I sort of run into, or they send me a text, or I get a Facebook Messenger or something like people out of state even. And so I'm just kind of really encouraged that God is using this time really to spread His word in many ways. And also I believe that there's a heightened spiritual curiosity and need. And so we're going to continue to do this digital platform and going through our YouTube and bringing the word in this way as we continue to go back. And God has used it, and we're going to just ask that He continues to use that. And you can really help us out by doing that. Also, I hope you've been getting on our website. We've got a number of resources for you, especially if you have children, that will definitely be a blessing of how to be the spiritual heads of your home during this time when we're sort of hunkered down a bit. myfaithchurch.org is our website name. Also, if you have any questions or if you want to subscribe to our weekend update, which comes out via email on Friday morning, just simply send us a note, info@myfaithchurch.org, and we'll definitely put you on the list. So we are just so encouraged that you are continuing to be faithful in your giving as well. Many of you are just sending, cash or check, snail mail. And we're so thankful that you are doing that. A number of you are learning how to donate online, going to our website, www.myfaithchurch.org. And a number of you are also texting in contributions to 73256. And we just are encouraged that you have been faithful. It's a less of a burden than I would have thought at the beginning of this whole thing. Well, we're going to be launching in to our second installment of our teaching series called Renewed Hope. Now, if you were with us last week, we looked at the final 5 chapters in the book of Judges that shares 2 stories and one horrible theme. And if you were able to listen to the message last week, if you haven't, I just encourage you to stop and actually go back and watch that before you watch this one. You didn't do it, did you? I thought I'd just kind of throw that in. But the theme of what we looked at in the book of Judges was this. It was a 400-year cycle down of spiritual corruption on every level. In families, in the priesthood and the spiritual leaders, and as the nation as a whole. 2 horrible stories. In fact, many of you actually wrote me a little note or texted me something and said, I have never heard those stories, Matt. And these are people who have been in church for most of their lives. And the reason why is because those aren't necessarily stories that we share, in Crossroads or children's church or Sunday school. They're pretty awful stories, the last 2 stories, last 5 chapters in the book of Judges. But the theme of the book of Judges was this. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they just saw fit. And when you just are your own standard unto yourself and you push God sort of out of the picture, the last 5 chapters will be the result of really any culture. We definitely see that in God's people. Well, if you remember last week, those 2 horrible stories, right? They began in very similar ways. Chapter 17 in Judges began this way. Now, a man named Micah from the hill country of Ephraim, sounds like a tall tale, doesn't it? Said to his mother, and if you remember, he stole something from his mother, and his mother said, well, bless you, son, and he actually rewarded him for his poor behavior. This is how that story, if you can remember, horrible story, this is how it began. Now, the second story in Judges 19 began this way, very similar, didn't it? Now, a Levite, which would have been a priest, who lived in a remote area in the hill country of Ephraim, right, here we are, took a concubine, which would have been a live-in girlfriend, and if you continue with that story, it's horrible. He cuts her up in 12 different pieces after she dies, and it's an awful story, right? Now, 1 Samuel chapter 1 begins in this way, right? So remember, this is Samuel, and this would be around the time of Samson. So this is the time frame, kind of within the book of Judges. They were contemporaries, or they overlap, I should say. There was a certain man from, I can't pronounce that, Ramathaim, a Zuphite from the hill country of Ephraim. And you're thinking to yourself, even though this is 1 Samuel chapter 1, you're thinking to yourself, oh great, here we go again. This is going to be another horrible story like the last 2 stories in the last 5 chapters of the book of Judges. But it's different. Whose name was Elkanah, he's the husband, that's a man's name, son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephraimite from the hill country of Ephraim. And so here we go again. You're thinking to yourself, it's going to be another one of those doozy stories of horrible corruption on 3 different levels. He had 2 wives, and you're thinking to yourself, oh, there we go again. Another messed up family, right? You've never seen anywhere in the scripture where there was a guy who had more than 1 wife where that situation actually turned out well. It was a cultural thing. This was not something that God said, hey, this is a good thing to do. He didn't come out and say it was bad until later, but every single incident that we have in the scripture where a man takes another wife, you go back to Abraham, and he was married to Sarah, yet Hagar came into the picture, and she gave birth to Ishmael. And you go to Jacob, and Jacob had two wives that were sisters, Rachel and Leah, and that household was a mess. And so sometimes the scripture just records it. Just records this is what happens. It doesn't come out and say this was wrong. It just shows you as the story continues that this is wrong, right? And so here we have the story continuing. And we're thinking, oh, this is just like those final two awful stories in the last 5 chapters of the book of Judges. He's from the same area. He's got a messed up situation in his home. One was called Hannah. We all know who Hannah is, probably. She's the heroine of the story. And the other, Peninnah. These are the 2 wives. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. Now, this is how the story starts, and you're thinking to yourself, here we go again. But it ends quite differently. Let's continue to read. If you have your Bible, you can follow along with me. First chapter of 1 Samuel. Year after year, this man went up from his town to worship and sacrifice to the Lord Almighty at Shiloh. In 2009, I spent about a month in Israel, and we actually spent a day in Shiloh. Didn't really realize at the time how important of a city Shiloh was. Shiloh was Jerusalem before Jerusalem was Jerusalem. During the time of Joshua and during the time of Judges, the Ark of the Covenant, which we'll talk more about that in the chapters to come, resided in the tabernacle, which was supposed to be a temporary place until the temple was built. And the temple, we know, was built under Solomon. It resided in this city called Shiloh in the tabernacle. But it wasn't very temporary. It was actually there for 369 years. So much that they actually put doors on this tabernacle, and that's where it stayed. Now, if you're familiar with the Ark of the Covenant, if you saw Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, it's the same ark as this box that God instructed Moses and Aaron to create. And on the lid of this Ark of the Covenant, there were 2 seraphs. And they were facing each other, and their wings, where they almost touched, was called the mercy seat. And God said, my presence will dwell there. And there's a lot of significance. We'll actually get into that in the weeks to come. But what that basically was God's way of, as a visual aid, God's way of instructing his people how to handle his presence. And when they followed the instructions of how to handle and transport and all this stuff with the Ark of the Covenant, when they were obedient, God's presence in their life was a blessing. But when they weren't, when they mishandled the Ark of the Covenant, when they used it for their own selfish motivations, when they were disobedient to the Lord and they worshiped and other false idols and gods, they saw God's presence in the form of his discipline. And the same is true today. If you want God's power and presence in your life, it always has to be in connection with your obedience. If you desire God as a rabbit's foot, or as a little trinket that will help you have a better day, or give you some type of material blessing, and yet you don't have any interest in terms of being obedient in your life, you will see the presence of God, but it's going to be in the hand of his discipline, not so much in his blessing. But it's always meant to draw you back. And so what we have here is probably the Day of Atonement, what's going on. So once a year, every Jewish person, every Israelite was required to go to the tabernacle, which happens to be in Shiloh here, resided there for 369 years. And this was a pilgrimage that you were really required to make. The Day of Atonement was when the sins of the entire year were atoned for. And there's all kinds of stuff that we could talk about the Day of Atonement, how that points to Jesus in many ways. There are 2 goats. One is the sacrificial goat, one is the scapegoat, and it's a very interesting picture. But during this time, the time of Judges, most people probably did not go up to Shiloh. It was just too inconvenient. In fact, the story that we looked at last week, Micah hired a priest to be in his own home. I mean, it was lazy, wasn't it? But here we have at least this family, Elkanah. There's some resemblance that he has some type of spiritual, moral compass. And if we kind of put the pieces together, this was actually a 9-hour trip one way. So this was not convenient. In fact, it was meant to be a little inconvenient. Is that what you're willing to do in order to go to the Lord's house? Are you willing to sacrifice your time, your energy, your resources, what it's going to cost to go to Shiloh? to be in the presence of the Lord, to have the sins of the entire year atoned for. This is what's going on. So at the Almighty Shiloh, where Hophni and Phinehas, we're going to talk about these guys in the future, the two sons of Eli would have been the high priest at the time, were priests of the Lord. Whenever the day came for Elkanah to sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to his wife Peninnah and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion because he loved her. And the Lord had closed her womb. Because the Lord had closed Hannah's womb, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. So this went on every time they went to Shiloh, and probably even when they were not there. This went on year after year. Whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept and would not eat. Her husband Elkanah would say to her, Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? Once when they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli the priest was sitting on his chair by the doorpost of the Lord's house. In her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly, and she made a vow, saying, Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head. Now this was a Nazirite vow. Samson took this Nazirite vow. It was he will be separate and he will be given unto the Lord's service. As she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. And Eli thought she was drunk and said to her, how long are you going to stay drunk? Put away your wine. Not so, my Lord, Hannah says. I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief. And she is groaning to the Lord in her situation. Eli answered, go in peace. A little twist of the story. It's not like the stories in the last 5 chapters of Judges. We're starting to see that there's hope here on the horizon. Eli answered, go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant what you have asked of him. And she said, may your servant find favor in your eyes. And she went her way and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. Early the next morning, they arose and they worshiped before the Lord, and then went back to the home at Ramah. Elkanah made love to his wife Hannah, and the Lord remembered her. So in the course of time, Hannah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, and by the way, Samuel became probably the greatest priest that Israel ever had. There's really not a blemish on the record of Samuel, saying, because I asked the Lord for him. When her husband Elkanah went up with all of his family to offer the annual sacrifice to the Lord and to fulfill his vow, Hannah did not go. This is a while later. She said to her husband, after the boy is weaned, I will take him and present him before the Lord, and he will live there always. And he says, do what seems best to you. Her husband Elkanah told her, stay here until you have weaned him. Only may the Lord make good his word. So the woman stayed at the home and nursed her son until she had weaned him. After he was weaned, we don't know, maybe he was 4, maybe he was 5. They nursed a little longer back then. She took the boy with her, young as he was, along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine, and brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh, this 9-hour trek. When the bull had been sacrificed, they brought the boy to Eli, the high priest at the time. And she said to him, pardon me, my Lord, as surely as I live, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I have asked of him. So now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life he will be given over to the Lord, and he worshiped the Lord there. The story started out very similar, and we were thinking, oh, here we go again. But it ended very differently, didn't it? If there's a key thought that we have here as we look at this first chapter of 1 Samuel, it's this. There's no distance too far that God's arm of hope can't reach. As far as God's people were away, as far as the families that we see in the book of Judges, and even here in chapter 1, as far messed up as they were in this unidealistic situation that they were all in. As far as Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, and we'll look at them, they were so corrupt, yet here is arising Samuel, and it's hard to find a blemish on his record. we start to see a turnaround, a renewed hope in a situation that at the beginning of the story we were like, oh, here we go again. But it turns out that she gives Samuel unto the Lord. There's this restoration in families that we're seeing. There's this restoration in individuals like Hannah and Elkanah, a renewed hope even in Eli. And we also see there's hope for the nation with Samuel being raised to be this high priest that we know that he's going to be in the future days to come in the chapters that we're going to look at. So how did they get there? And what's the message for us? Well, here it is, right? No matter how far you have gone, no matter how unidealistic of a relationship that you have, or how unideal your finances are, or your health, or your situation, or the country that you live in, it is never too far that God's arm of hope cannot reach. You know, sometimes people say, you have no idea, Matt, what I've done. And my first response to them is this: you give yourself way too much credit. And I'm not saying that as a human race, we haven't, as a human race, have not been, we've done some evil things. But if we think that we have the capability, that God's grace and God's hope cannot reach farther, as far as the way we've gotten from God, his arm far outreaches the length that we have gone. And so that should bring us hope as we look at this time of Judges, those last horrible 2 stories, last 5 chapters. Here we see this renewal of hope. And so what we're going to do, there are some certain steps that I think that we need to pick up here that Hannah placed in her life, these steps toward this renewed hope. And this is where we're going to spend the rest of our time. Here's the first one. It's right here. Hannah displayed a groaning out of her heart to the Lord. She was in a tough situation. She was in a marriage triangle, wasn't she? She was in a marriage with her husband, but there was another woman in the picture, Peninnah. They were both married to the same guy. A very unidealistic relationship. Have you ever been there? Or some of the relationships in your life, whether it's with your children or with your spouse, or some of maybe it's with your finances or with your health or with your career, or just a discontentment, and you're like, it's not meant to be like this. How did Hannah handle this? Well, she was honest. It's so interesting. Every single person in the story that we see, whether it's Peninnah or whether it is Elkanah or whether it's even Eli, they're dealing with their disappointment incorrectly, except for Hannah. Peninnah, she is experiencing this unidealistic relationship with her husband. She wants what Hannah has. Hannah has the love of her husband. Everybody in this story wants what the other person has, isn't it? Hannah, she has the love of her husband, but she wants children like Peninnah has. Elkanah, he's a guy who just wants peace in his home, and he just wants Hannah to be happy, and yet what she really wants, he can't provide her, and so what does he do? He gives her an extra portion of meat. He has what he has. Well, I've got this extra provision. Maybe I'll just kind of give this to her, and it'll make up for this deficit in her life. They're all dealing with this unidealistic situation in unhealthy ways, except for Hannah. Hannah handles it correctly. She's honest before the Lord. She groans before the Lord. This is not complaining. She's not blaming the Lord, but she's just simply being honest to the Lord. Look what she says. In her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. She's not trying to cover it up. She's not trying to find someone to blame like Peninnah did. She's not trying to circumvent the process and cover up the pain like Elkanah was trying to do by giving Hannah an extra portion of meat from a sacrifice. Good luck, pal, it didn't work, right? She goes to the Lord and she's groaning before him. Here's my situation. It's not ideal. Lord, here it is. And she made a vow saying, Lord Almighty, if you look on your servant's misery and remember me and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head. As she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard, and Eli thought she was drunk, and said to her, how long are you going to stay drunk? Put away your wine. Not so, my Lord. See, it's so different. Eli had probably never experienced someone just being so honest. before in the temple. He's used to somebody drinking away their problems, right? He's a little bit cynical, he's a little bit jaded, he's a little bit sarcastic, and he probably is thinking, here's this woman again, right? Another woman just like the rest of them, right? Another person just like the rest of them, covering up their situation with wine. But that's not what Hannah was doing. Not so, my Lord. I'm a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief. God gives us a way to cope correctly with the unidealistic situations that we often find ourselves in. Sometimes those situations that we find ourselves in are a result of our own poor choices. Sometimes it's just a situation because life throws us a curveball. But whatever it may be, whether it's our fault or whether it's just life or whether it's a combination of the two, we can either cover it up, we can either look and seek a target to blame, we can try to circumvent it and use something else to fill the gap in the hole like Elkanah was trying to do. Or we can do what Hannah did. She was simply groaning before the Lord. You know, the Lord can handle that stuff. Don't think that you're going to dump too much on the Lord's shoulders. He's got some pretty broad shoulders. He just wants you to be honest with him. And when you do so, there is an element of healing that results from simply just being honest and groaning before the Lord. It's the first step toward a renewed hope. Here's the second step that we see Hannah. Hannah allowed a grieving of her heart to be shared with others. It's not just a groaning of her heart to the Lord. That was the first step. But we also see that she was willing to share her grieving with others. Now, it didn't turn out necessarily idealistically, but she didn't give up. In fact, there was some misinterpretations, there were some misunderstandings, especially when it came to her husband and Eli. Because the Lord had closed Hannah's womb, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. This went on year after year. Whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept and would not eat. Her husband Elkanah would say to her, and he does a great job at the beginning of this, doesn't he? He's relating to her. He's displaying compassion. Hannah, why are you weeping? I see your pain. I see your situation. Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? He does such a great job up until here. Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? It's kind of a typical guy, right? Can't I fix this? Aren't I enough? You know, one of the things I think we can learn from this is that there is an element of your contentment and peace that no human being can fill. If you're looking for that in a spouse or in a boyfriend or in a girlfriend or in a job or in a career, you will not find that. Why? Because there's an element of that God reserves for himself that only he can fulfill. And especially as a husband, that can be very difficult for us to admit that we can't be everything to our spouse. And here we see the frustration that Elkanah has. He misunderstands. Hannah just wants him to grieve with her. He doesn't want her to fix it. Want him to fix it. He wants to fix it. He wants to be everything to her. And here she just wants him to grieve with her. This grief was misunderstood. But yet we see, and we'll see this in a second, Hannah doesn't give up on her husband. But also we see this with Eli. As she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart. Her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thought there was a misinterpretation. Elkanah misunderstood. Eli misinterpreted. He thought that she was drunk, probably because that happened quite often. This is the time of Judges. People would come up to Shiloh for the wrong reasons, to drink away their problems or to hide their problems. But here's this woman just being honest before the Lord. He thinks that she's drunk, and he says to her, how long are you going to stay drunk? Misinterprets. Put away your wine. Not so, my Lord, Hannah replies. I'm a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I've been praying here out of my great anguish and grief. Usually when we have a grieving and people don't understand it, they misunderstand it, or they misinterpret it, the tendency for you and for me is always to say, well, then I don't need anyone. All I need is either God. Nobody understands what I'm going through, and then we have a tendency to keep people at arm's length. Hannah did not do that. She understood her husband had good intentions. She understood, I believe, that Eli probably had experienced this before. She doesn't say, well, forget you guys. You don't understand my grief. All I need is myself. She doesn't do that. In fact, we actually see that she continues, even though they misunderstood and they misinterpreted her grief. They didn't handle it well. They didn't know how to handle it. They were men. They didn't know how to handle it well. She doesn't give up on them. In fact, we see something in Elkanah's relationship with Hannah and as well as Eli's relationship with Hannah as the story continues. This is after she was given this promise. When her husband Elkanah went up with all his family to offer the annual sacrifice to the Lord and to fulfill his vow, Hannah did not go. She said to her husband, after the boy is weaned, I will take him and present him before the Lord, and he will live there always. Look at how he responds. So much different than the other way that he responded. Do what seems best to you. They had healed the situation that they went through, grieving together correctly, had actually solidified their relationship. Samuel was the product of that. Do what seems best to you. Her husband Elkanah told her, stay here until you have weaned him. Only may the Lord make good. He learned how to trust the Lord too. Make good his word. So the woman stayed at home and nursed her son until she had weaned him. And also she went to Eli, and there was a trust that Eli had established with Hannah as well. When was the last time not only have you groaned to the Lord, but you allowed others to grieve with you in your situation? Sometimes they're going to misunderstand it. Sometimes they're going to misinterpret it. Or are you going to say, well, it's one and done? Forget you. Nobody understands what I'm going through. Or are you going to see this is just human beings? And you may be on the other side of that at one time as well. You've probably been misinterpreted or you've been misunderstood as well. We are relational people. During this whole COVID-19, I think we're starting to realize this. We're starting to miss one another, right? And we're starting to put aside some of those petty differences perhaps that we've had with people and just, you know what, that was so silly. I really need these people, in my life. I missed them. I didn't realize what I had. Boy, Hannah understood that the value that she had with her husband, the value that she had was Eli. Even though they misunderstood, even though they misinterpreted her situation, her grief, she still allowed them to grieve with her. And we see a growing in that relationship with her husband and with Eli. And actually, here's number 3 in terms of a renewed hope. Hannah experienced a growing out of her obedience to the Lord's promise. So she groaned before the Lord. She wasn't blaming the Lord. She was just being honest before the Lord. She also allowed others to grieve with her, even though they weren't perfect. She gave them a second chance, and we see a growing in that relationship. But we also see, don't we, an incredible growing out of the promise that was given to her. Sometimes we look at the story in 1 Samuel chapter 1 and we think, this is what this means. If we're just persistent enough like Hannah was, if we're just honest before the Lord, and if we, make sure that we're okay spiritually in every single aspect, eventually God, we're going to wear him down and he's going to give us what we want. That's not the point of this story. And the reason why I know this, the source of Hannah's joy was not Samuel. The source of Hannah's joy was the Lord and her living in the Lord's promise. If Samuel was the source of her joy, she would not have given Samuel back. She grew in her relationship with the Lord. Samuel was just the icing on the cake. Now you're thinking to yourself, how do we know this? Well, let's look at this, right? Eli answered, go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him. She said, may your servant find favor in your eyes. Then she went her way and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. This is before she's pregnant. This is before Samuel is born. She took the Lord's promise that came through Eli and said, the promise that God has given me, I will live out of that joy. There are so many promises that we have in the scripture. Promises that he'll never leave us or forsake us. Promises that no matter what circumstance that we go through, that there's a promise of peace and comfort and grace and mercy. We have promises that have not yet been fulfilled. Jesus is coming back. We live in the joy, not of our circumstances, do we? You've heard me say this so many times. If you are dependent on your circumstances, your life will be a roller coaster. Our joy is dependent about living in the joy of the Lord's promises, and He's given us so much. Early the next morning, they arose and they worshiped before the Lord and then went back to their home at Ramah. Elkanah made love to his wife Hannah, and the Lord remembered her. So in the course of time, we don't know how long this was. Was it months? Was it years? Finally, she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, saying, because I asked the Lord for him. And then after Samuel was weaned, isn't this interesting? As Samuel is growing, we don't know how long that took. Was he 4? Was he 5? But we also see that during this time of Samuel growing physically, we also see that Hannah is growing spiritually. She's growing in the joy of the fulfillment of the Lord's promise. She knows that the source of her joy is not Samuel. He is going back to the house of the Lord. He's going to be this great high priest, replacing the Hophni and Phinehas, the 2 horrible, corrupt sons of Eli, right? We'll see this in the future chapters in 1 Samuel. But we see this growing in the Lord, don't we, with Hannah? Let's continue to look at the scripture. After he was weaned, she took the boy with her, young as he was, along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, very expensive flour, and a skin of wine, and brought them to the house of the Lord at Shiloh. She was only required to bring Samuel. But we see as she has been growing, there's this generosity of her spirit. She realized that there's this spirit of anticipation. I'm going to give him back to the Lord. And out of the overflow of this, what does she do? She brings a bull. She brings an ephah of flour. She brings a skin of wine. She brings them to the house of the Lord because she understands the joy of the Lord is not in Samuel. She loves Samuel. In fact, every single time she would go to worship to the house of the Lord, they continued this regimen, I'm sure. I'm sure she brought more gifts. She probably brought a different robe every single year for Samuel. We don't know. We're not sure. But I'm sure there is this heightened anticipation as every year she would get to go and worship the Lord and also see her son. And I bet you she continued to bring gifts like this as well. When the bull had been sacrificed, they brought the boy to Eli, and she said to him, pardon me, my Lord, as surely as I live, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I have asked of him. So now I give him to the Lord. Now for his whole life he will be given over to the Lord. And he worshiped the Lord there. Now there's a takeaway that we have here. Very simple. If you feel far from God, understand his arm of hope can far outreach however far you think you are. You give yourself way too much credit. And you don't give God's grace enough, I should say. Are you willing, though, to take the steps that Hannah took? You know, in this story, we see renewed hope. A renewed hope that comes to a family. A renewed hope that comes to the spiritual leadership of God's temple or tabernacle at Shiloh. We see a renewed hope eventually because Samuel's going to become the spiritual leader of God's people and really turn them around, him in partnership with King David as well. But there were certain steps. How are you at groaning before the Lord? Are you being honest? Or are you trying to deal with your disappointment in a different way, like Peninnah, looking for a target, looking for someone to blame? Or are you like what Eli thought, somebody that's just using a substance, right, to cover up the situation that you're facing? Whether it's something that you brought upon yourself, whether it's something that someone has brought upon you, or a combination of the two, how are you doing at being just honest before the Lord? No masks. No veils, just this is the situation, God. It's not ideal. That is God's coping mechanism of how we can not blame him, but grieve with him. How are you doing at grieving with others? Are you allowing people, even though they're not going to be perfect, there's going to be Elkanahs, there's going to be Eli's in every single person's life. They're going to misunderstand and misinterpret what you are going through. Are you just going to say one and done, nobody, I don't need anybody? Or are you going to continue to say, I know you're not perfect, but here's the situation. Don't try to fix it. Just understand this is unideal. And we just need to go before the Lord. Just grieve with me. Be patient with people. How are you doing at growing in the Lord's promise? Is that being demonstrated in your generosity, in your anticipation of being able at some point going to the Lord's house, right? And presenting your offering before him and renewing and reuniting relationships that we haven't seen with people in a while. I hope this time is creating an anticipation as we see in the anticipating heart of Hannah. Can't wait to go to the house of the Lord. The Lord bless you. The Lord keep you. May his face shine upon you and give you strength.